Ambassador Gilmore, thank you for being my guest today and welcome on the program. Dutch-led investigators have recently released the recordings that, as they say, may implicate top Russian officials, including the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, in the war in Ukraine and downing of MH17. To your knowledge, to what extent are they actually involved in the military operation in Ukraine?
I can't answer what the specific people are doing or have done, but I can answer that the Russian government and the Russian military are very deeply involved in eastern Ukraine. This is not some type of rebellion. This is not some type of group of renegades. These are people who are sponsored by, trained by, fight with Russian army people. And it's very important that...
But do you think that top Russian officials are in some way involved in controlling, in managing the military operation in East Ukraine?
Well, without knowing personally, I would say of course. Naturally, you wouldn't expect Russian army people to be moving into Ukraine without the authority of top Russian people in Moscow, of course.
In your regular statements, weekly statements, you say that Mr. Zelensky and his administration are committed to the long-term solution of the conflict in East Ukraine. However, you also state that the SMM recorded multiple ceasefire violations and also convoys that are crossing Ukrainian border with so-called humanitarian aid. Do you think that Russia is really committed to end the conflict?
You know, we can't answer that. We're hopeful, though, that they are committed to ending the conflict. They've entered into the Minsk Accord, the Minsk Agreement. They now have cooperated to some extent with the separation of the forces. If there's a ceasefire violation or two, that's not helpful, but it's okay right now that the parties are separating. Now it's really up to the Russians to go forward and do what is necessary to carry out the Minsk Accords. President Zelensky has in fact extended himself out. He's taken political gambles. He's trying to do what is necessary to keep his promises. He's trying to actually end this conflict through diplomatic channels. And now it's up to the Russians to extend their hand of friendship back out to the Ukrainian people.
But what is your personal impression? Will they do so? Are they really interested in putting the end to the conflict?
That's going to be something we're going to find out. There's going to be very soon. We think there's going to be a summit.
When will you find it out?
Oh, well, we're going to find out when as the process continues to proceed. If, in fact, there is a summit meeting, if, in fact, the Minsk process continues on, if, in fact, the Russians remove themselves from this conflict zone, then we will know that the Russian government has changed their attitude and it's time to bring peace to Ukraine. But until then, we just have to wait and see whether they're in good faith.
But some Ukrainians claim that the path that President Zelensky has taken is, in fact, capitulation. Do you agree with that?
Not yet. I don't believe
When will it be a capitulation?
I don't believe it's going to be a capitulation.
But how it looks like right now?
No, I still don't think that it looks like a capitulation.
Why?
Because Zelensky understands that it's necessary to restore the Ukrainian sovereignty completely back into its entire territory, including Crimea. And that means that there has to be a process that goes forward, and President Zelensky has moved forward with that process.
Okay, among some peace proposals, you have already mentioned the Minsk Agreement. There is the well-known Steinmeier formula that calls for elections to be held in the separatist-controlled regions in East Ukraine under Ukrainian legislation and supervision of the OSCE. And of course, if the OSCE judges these elections as free and fair, then there will be initiated a process to grant a special status for these territories, and Ukraine will get control over the border. For me, this plan does not sound really convincing. Do you think that it's really realistic that the Steinmeier formula is a workable solution?
It can work if President Putin and the Russian government are committed to the Steinmeier formula. If they're prepared,
Are they committed?
we're going to find out. Their duty now under the Steinmeier formula is to remove their troops from eastern Ukraine.
Right.
Let's see if they do that, if they keep their word, if they do what they say they're going to do, if they respond to President Zelensky's outreach. If they do that, then we'll know that there's...
But it's so strange that any fair and free elections can be possibly held in the territories which are controlled by another country.
You are right. You can't have free and fair elections in that community as long...
No, you cannot.
You cannot. As long as the Russians and their army and their soldiers are there, there can't be free and fair elections, and therefore they have to get out so that, in fact, the free and fair elections that they've agreed to can occur. OSCE, by the way, they can monitor these elections, but it's going to be very difficult for the Human Dimension Organization of OSCE to declare anything, but they can monitor them in order to determine whether they're legitimate.
This is one thing, disengagement, yes.
Yes.
The other thing is that these fair and free elections should occur in the regions controlled by pro-Russian separatist forces.
The Russian regular people have got to get out in order to create some kind of environment where there can be a free and fair election. That has to occur, and it has to be conducted under Ukrainian law. It has to have the prospect of giving back the sovereignty, of controlling the border, of stopping these munitions we suspect going back and forth. These things are all steps that Russia has to take. And if they take them, then that means that they're prepared to actually carry out the Minsk agreements, to extend a welcoming hand back to President Zelensky and move forward in a successful elimination of the conflict.
If you compare policies of President Zelensky and President Poroshenko, what policy is more efficient? I'm talking only about Russia. Their policies towards Russia.
Well, I think that President Zelensky is trying to do more outreach. He campaigned to the people of Ukraine saying that he was going to do what he could do to end the conflict. Now, he's going to have a willing partner on the Russian side, and that remains to be seen. If, in fact, there is a summit, we should watch very closely what that summit does and the way that President Putin behaves. Because after all, what we really have to have here is an elimination of this conflict. The humanitarian cost has been dreadful. 1,300 people or more have been killed. There's a dreadful situation going on right now with elderly people and people in the conflict zone. If President Putin is prepared to cease this and remove the Russian army and the Russian authorities and Russian trainers and Russian officers away from Ukraine, then there is a chance that Ukraine can get back to where it needs to be, sovereignty can be restored, and they can become a good neighbor of the Russian people.
What will Putin get if he agrees to put the end to the conflict?
Well, I think the one thing he would get would be a message to people in Russia that he is willing to, in fact, conduct himself in a way that isn't aggressive towards the West.
The Russians are not that much interested in Ukraine right now, domestically. I think that there's gonna be a deal, yes. I don't understand why he is interested in withdrawing from eastern Ukraine. What will he get?
Well, I think what he could get is a new relationship with the West. Right now, by the attempted conquest of Crimea, Russia has defined itself, and the people of Russia have defined themselves in a very, very negative way. It's caused the West to react. It's caused the West to be defensive. It's caused the West to be distrustful. These are all things that have happened as a result of the invasion of eastern Ukraine and this attempt to take over Crimea, which was not part of the Russian country after the fall of the Soviet Union. And now the Western countries all have a right to say, what's next? Well, if President Putin actually follows a process in accordance with the Minsk agreements, gets his people out of eastern Ukraine, and they have free and fair elections, this will be an enormous signal to the rest of the world that Russia is once again prepared to return to a peaceful course.
Will the sanctions be lifted if he withdraws from Ukraine?
If he withdraws from Crimea and Ukraine?
No, only I'm talking about East Ukraine right now, because there are sanctions related to the military conflict in East Ukraine. There are sanctions related to Crimea.
The United States government and the European Union, I'm confident, will assess all of that and determine whether President Putin's government is in good faith or whether they're playing some sort of game. But that is a decision to be made by the United States government and the European Union governments in the future, depending upon circumstances.
So Ukraine has been in the spotlight not only in our part of the world, but in the US, and it's because of the controversial conversation between President Trump and President Zelensky, and this all led to the impeachment probe, which is ongoing right now. And I personally read, among other things, the call transcript, the whistleblower complaint, and text messages of Ambassador Kurt Volker. And I have to admit, I was shocked. What were your feelings when you learned about it?
My job as ambassador to the OSCE is to represent American interests in the OSCE and to try to assert American leadership here in the OSCE. I am not connected or concerned about those issues that are going on in Washington. Those are political matters. I am an ambassador and a diplomat. And my job here is to protect the interests on behalf of President Trump, to protect the interests of the United States, and to work with our allies in a cooperative way, and that's what I'm doing.
Does this situation in any way affect your daily job right now with Ukraine, etc.? Because you are saying you're not a politician, but I guess that you're a diplomat, a politician, because you're making statements about the situation in East Ukraine, for example.
As a matter of policy, I am, but your point is the correct, important question, and that is America solidly behind the Ukraine? We are. We are, and in fact, at the OSCE, we go to a permanent council meeting every week, and every week, the United States and my mission speaks out on behalf of Ukraine. We're very strong. President Trump has sent defensive weapons to the Ukraine. This is a new policy that President Trump has put into place. We're very strong in terms of outreach and communications. We're very strong in backing up the Ukrainians in their sovereignty and independence because it's in connection and accordance with the values of the Helsinki Accords and the final act, which Russia agreed to and should continue to adhere to today.
So as far as I understand, the Ukraine gate will not have any major implications on the US-Ukrainian relations.
There is no direction to me anywhere from President Trump or the State Department or anybody else in the United States that has in any way been negatively influenced by any type of political activity going on, any kind of inquiries or activities going on in Washington. My directions remain the same, and I am carrying them out.
On the 6th of November, there was a media conference held by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia and the OSCE. I attended this conference as a guest, and I wonder what are your takeaways from this conference, because it seemed to me that it legitimized Russian state-controlled media, which are blamed of producing tons of propaganda. What was your impression?
Well, I've expressed concern about that.
What kind of concern?
I've expressed concern that a conference like this might be used by the Russian government to legitimate.
It has already been used.
Well, I was concerned about that, and I've expressed that publicly. We are in favor of openness of communications and openness of the media and openness of information in Russia, because after all, that was one of the basic premises of the final act in the Helsinki Accords: openness of information. Freedom of the media.
Did this conference contribute to these goals?
Well, I think that the media representative attempted to do that, and I think that was what he in good faith was trying to do. But facts are facts. And the facts are that there have been imposition of new laws that have said that any non-governmental organizations that speak out can be declassified as foreign agents and banned. That's very different from the United States. We may ask people to register, but we don't close people up. In Russia, they do. and that's not a good thing. Demonstrators have been attacked and not allowed to demonstrate. These are concerns that we have, danger to the Russian media, independent journalists. We simply want openness. We're not interested in trying to tell the Russian people what they should do or think. Well, we believe that they should have access to all the information. For example, the new law that took place on November the 1st that might give some control over Russia over the internet. I can't think of anything worse than that. The internet is openness of ideas and openness of communications. That's all we want. We want the Russian people to have access to everything so they can make up their own minds about what's right and what's wrong.
But will the OSCE organize the same conferences with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia somewhere in the future?
In some other location?
Yes, for example.
Well, no, the job of the representative for freedom of the media is in fact to push those ideas out there throughout the entire OSCE region, which, as you know, is 57 countries. And it's a consensus-based organization. The government of Russia has the same voice in this organization as the United States does, or Germany, or any other country. So it's a good forum and an opportunity for communication and diplomacy. It's a good opportunity for that. I'm very pleased with this appointment and being the ambassador for the United States to the OSCE.
Is there any substantial Russian governmental influence in the OSCE?
Certainly.
Could you elaborate on this? What structures are the most interesting for the Russian government inside the OSCE?
They have a stake in the OSCE by virtue that they have their ambassador here. Just as I am ambassador of the OSCE, the Russian government has its ambassador to the OSCE. He's a very pleasant man. He's a very forceful man. He stands up for his country, but he has a veto or a consensus veto over everything the way anybody does. And they speak out. The main thing about the OSCE...
I'm not talking about formal things that you are talking. I'm talking about informal things. Do you feel any informal influence of Russia inside the OSCE?
Well, they have their formal influence inside the OSCE. Oh, it's true. They have the opportunity to speak out on behalf of appointments, on behalf of conferences and meetings. And they have their ability to speak out and to be influential in the organization. But then so do many other countries as well. I don't think that their position is in any way detrimental to the OSCE, other than the fact that there are things that we believe are right and push forward that sometimes the Russian government stops because of consensus.
Do you think that Russia actually belongs to the OSCE?
Certainly. I believe the OSCE is a very broad-based, transatlantic, international organization that gives us the opportunity to have communications throughout. This is one of the few opportunities, for example, for the Americans and the Russians to speak to each other directly.
Yes, that's right, but I'm talking about the principles on which the OSCE is based. Does Russia follow these principles?
They agreed to those principles.
They agreed, but do they follow?
We believe that the attempt to annex Crimea is a direct violation of the Final Act and the Helsinki Accords, and that is a change. Because Russia has signed up to these agreements. They are good not only for everybody else in the OSCE, these principles are good for the Russian people also. And we believe that, for example, the attack on eastern Ukraine and the attempt to take over Crimea, these are violations of the Final Act and the Helsinki
That's
principles.
why I'm asking, does Russia belong to the OSCE? As far as I understand, you have doubts.
No, I have no doubts that they should be in the OSCE and that they should adhere to those principles, and we call on them to do so all the time.
Do they listen?
Are they listening? Well, that remains to be seen. That's up to what we see in the future. But right now, I think there's improvements that they could make.
There was a celebration that marked the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. If you compare the relations between Russia and the West right now and before the fall of the Berlin Wall, what is the situation right now? How would you describe the current relations between Russia and the West? what period is most historic period, is most demonstrative? Do you feel that it's like in the times of the Cold War?
It's much closer to that now. As you know, I was a soldier stationed in Germany during the Cold War. I saw the Berlin Wall. I celebrate the fact that it came down in 1989 because of the good things that it did for countries of Eastern Europe and also for Russia. It was a big step forward for the Russian people. It was a good step forward for people across Europe. And now it's turned. And this is very sad and it's very unfortunate, and it should not be going on. This is a time now of tension that I can assure you really is not necessary. I am aware of no aggressive intention towards Russia or the Russian people by anyone, and certainly not in the United States. And I think that a reaction that causes the Russian people to believe that is bad. And we hope that by further communication, by openness, by constantly talking and communicating, like shows like this, for example, that we can actually reach out to the Russian people and persuade them that there is no evil intent or aggressiveness towards Russia.
You think that the image of the U.S. and Russia is really bad, don't you?
Do I think so?
Yes.
Well, actually...
It seems to me, because you are making all the time the statements that the U.S. is by no way an enemy to Russia.
I don't think that there's nothing that I know of to indicate that the United States has any aggressive intent towards Russia. But at the same time, Russia now has defined itself in a bad way. We can't ignore this. We can't ignore this invasion of eastern Ukraine. We can't ignore these hybrid type of attacks that we see over the internet, over cyber types of things, economic pressures. We can't ignore all of these things. And we have to simply respond and protect ourselves. But there's no intention that I'm aware of anybody to do anything bad towards Russia.
You have already mentioned that you worked in West Germany in the 70s. You were a counterintelligence agent. Is this right?
That is true.
What were your assignments?
What were my assignments?
Yes.
My assignments at that time were to protect.
You can. It's not classified anymore. I think so.
It's always classified. My objective at that time was to keep security and to make sure that the United States military forces and also all of our allies, including our German friends and others, were protected. After all, we were staring right there at the Iron Curtain.
But what did you do?
We were staring right there at the Berlin Wall. What did I do? I made sure that that Russian espionage agents were not getting information they shouldn't have.
Based on your extensive experience, what are the similarities and differences between the USSR and Russia?
Well, I think that I would prefer to speak to where we are today. The United States is fundamentally based upon the notion of freedom of people. And we do not believe that some people in Germany or the United States are entitled to freedoms, and people in Russia somehow are different and they're not entitled to freedoms. We don't believe that. We believe in liberty and the confidence and the opportunity for people in the future, for all people everywhere. The Russians will have to speak for themselves as to what kind of future they really want for themselves and for their children. They have to define for themselves what being a Russian really means. But we don't believe that it means being separate from the liberties and freedoms of people everywhere.
Okay, I would restate my question. What is the image of Russia in the United States right now?
I don't know. I think that we're still deciding based upon this new situation that we've seen over the last number of years.
I mean, not in the political circles. I mean, overall, what's the image of Russia? Has it changed to the worse, or has it remained on the same level? Is it good or is it bad?
You know, I think the American people would like to be friends with Russia. I think that there is a desire, really, for more outreach. and for a sense of fraternity between the people of the United States and the people of Russia. I think that the American people are actually very forthcoming. And now what we're seeing, of course, is President Zelensky's reached out his hand in a very real way in order to try to eliminate these conflicts and go forward into the future in a better way. So I think that there's plenty of opportunity there. But if Russia defines itself as an aggressive power, if it conquers people, if it sends people to gulags, which they did with Sentsov.
That's why I'm asking, what's the image of Russia and Putin in the U.S.?
Oh, things can always get better. But right now, I think that that Vladimir Putin is seen as leading a very aggressive foreign policy. Our job is to protect ourselves and to make sure that there's no further invasion or attack or danger, for example, to the people of the Baltic states who are independent, free people. And we believe that that should be the case.
Do you see any threats to the Baltic states?
I see the Crimea invasion, an attempt to take that country over, as a warning sign that requires us to do things in order to try to protect ourselves and our allies.
Ambassador Gilmore, thank you for the interview.
Good, thank you very much.
Thank you.